On. All right, so we're recording. All right, so Nick Tumminello here, my man Mike Israetel. What Mike and I are going to do is address a follow-up from a social media post that I posted saying that I'm not for any trainer regulation because I don't want any more government oversight in my life. Now that post kind of blew up, so Mike and I wanted to discuss some details a little further. He and I are both of the mindset that the best regulation for trainers is self-regulation. That's what we're pretty much going to argue, but we are going to steelman the proposition of, we'll explain what steelmanning is if you're not familiar, of, how trainer regulation could benefit and also address some of the common arguments for it, and then what we think that will look like actually in the real world. Now, I want to clarify a few misconceptions before we move on. First is, we are not talking about the fact that we don't want to see any regulation in anything, right? So saying there's no regulation for restaurants to make sure their food is kept well, or there's no regulation in medicine to make sure that medicine you give is not poisonous or anything like that. No, that couldn't be further from the truth. What we're saying is just continuing to add more regulation. We're not necessarily for it. And specifically in the training field, we think basically the free market system, in the case, in regards to what I mean by self-regulation, is really the best system that we have for our field. Now, that brings up some of the comments and questions about, well, look at the highly respected fields like doctors and lawyers. They have bar exams and so forth. Therefore, we should have that. But we're really not like doctors and lawyers. We don't want that sort of massive oversight. So you brought this up. I thought the same thing. We're more like chefs. So first off, we want to clarify what we're more like as a job before we get into this. So Mike, since you and I talked last, you brought up a good example about how we're more like chefs. So I'll let you ride on that a little bit.
Yeah. So, doctors, for example, they're in a real life or death job. So at least on a surface level, you could clearly posit why some minimum standards regulation could be a good idea.
Sure.
And on the, you need a doctor, need in some real serious circumstances. Now, personal trainers are more like chefs in the sense that you don't actually ever need a chef. You voluntarily go to a restaurant. It's outside of your way. It's technically a luxury purchase. And, chefs can span a wide variety of conditions of competency, and you're almost certainly not going to die unless they do something egregiously wrong that we just can't regulate away. And they could do that anyway if they were regulated, like put poison in your food or something like that.
Right.
So personal trainers, do they have the capacity to hurt people? Yeah, sure, to some extent. I know more than you would by yourself in the gym. Mm-hmm. Probably less. So if you're interested, people don't do medicine on themselves. Like, you're not going to do surgery on your own leg. Right. So it could be saying, okay, leg surgeon, somebody who does surgery could be really regulated, but you're going to work out yourself anyway. And if someone's going to help you, 9 times out of 10, they're going to do a better job. And 99 trillion times out of whatever, they're not going to kill you or maim you or anything like that. Mm. So all of a sudden, the whole the doctors are regulated. Doctors face a considerably different set of conditions. And chefs, I'm not sure there's a huge licensing exam for chefs, or that the supply of chefs is artificially restricted by licensure regulation. I'm sure there's some of that. Mm-hmm. But if someone says to you, hey, what would happen if chefs were not regulated tomorrow? You probably wouldn't be like, oh, it's a disaster. You'd be like, oh, I didn't even know they really had regulations. I'm pretty sure if you get promoted to chef, you probably don't suck. And there's plenty of opportunities at various line cook and assistant jobs for you to sort of get weeded out.
Yeah, and nobody's telling them what recipes they can't make or whatever. And they have a very similar regulation in regards to safety and food preparation, right? Sure. Well, we have that if you're in a facility already, correct? We have to pass certain safety standards and have exit signs. So there is already regulation if you're in a facility. And the other thing I would say too is that, unlike doctors and lawyers take bar exams too to make sure that they're all speaking the same language, even though they haven't met one another, right? So they come together in the courtroom, or they have to talk to one another. Somebody goes to a different state or whatever. They all are buying into the same concept. I work for myself, so I don't have to speak your language or anybody else's language. I get to dictate my system, how I speak, what's important to me. Just like a chef, this is how we do things here. This is the procedure. If it works, other people will probably copy it, right? So we have minimum standards of safety, which is we already have that in facility management, which is where trainers deal with. You have to have insurance, all these sorts of things. You have liability risks. We have tremendous liability risks as trainers. We can get our pants sued off, and in fact, it happens to trainers a lot of times. So there already is many things out there that are putting standards upon us. Okay, now let's put this out there. So let's start getting into some of these arguments about why we're really not for some sort of government oversight, which we call regulation. And we'll get into some specifics in a second. Here is my proposition on that. We're not going to really talk politics here, but we talked on the phone, and Mike and I are pretty libertarian in regards to our value system. So that kind of colors our views here. But I would say this, we all know the world doesn't run on good intentions, but it's good intentions to want to say, oh, we're going to elevate the field, we're going to make people safer by creating some sort of regulation. However, you have to create systems based on real human motivations, right? So what are incentives? What incentivizes us? That's the free market. And so the free market has its own type of regulation, just like a restaurant does. The best restaurants that are the cleanest, that have the best reviews, that have the best tasting food, the staff is the happiest, so on and so forth, do the best. Same thing with trainers. They can get their pants sued off if they poison people. So the issue is that this idea that you just can't regulate out bad behavior. That's really at the surface of this. And the idea is that, well, if you're not for regulation, then you just are lazy and you just don't want to inconvenience yourself. No, it's not that at all. It's that we know what this actually will look like when it's implemented, right? And what happens is humans are involved, and you're going to have humans that are in these oversight boards and developing these tests. And now they have their own motivations, which are selfishness and greed and all the incentives. And you start giving some other people control over what things do, and that starts to make everybody else's life miserable. That's what things look like in the real world. So the free market is the best way. Well, people say, well, it's for your own good. No, I know what's best for my own good. You know what's best for your own good. Someone in some bureaucratic office does not know what's for my own good. They know it's for their own good. So the road to hell, was paved with good intentions, and a lot of shitty ass policies were done by it's for your own good. So I don't buy that to save my life. Now, that being said, let's start with at least, I want to do two things, Mike. Let's clarify what a steel man would be in regards to why would we benefit from regulation. And two, let's be a little specific in regards to what we mean by regulation. Like, what would that actually look like? So first, let's do a little steel man here. And if you all don't know what a steel man is, it's the opposite of straw man. Straw man is where you basically argue against a weaker position than the person is arguing to make their argument easier to take down. In this case, we're going to create the best form of the argument to then prop it up as high as possible, and then we'll address it from there. That's the fairest way to go about it.
Sure. So regulation, as we see it, and for the purposes of this discussion, for personal trainers, is a national licensure body that means that if you don't have a license from this national licensure body, you cannot practice as a personal trainer in any capacity. And the licensure would involve paying a set of fees, because the governing body has to have money somehow.
Sure.
And passing a certain set of tests, perhaps one big exam and some continuing education kind of exams, to make sure that you have passed the requirements for qualification to be a personal trainer. And that is what I think, and if you are personal training people without one of these exams and registration with this national governing body, you could be legally prosecuted for practicing without a license, which is, comes with various legal recourse, fines, etc., failure to cooperate. Eventually, they take all your money away, go to jail or something like that. Same as you would practicing law without a license or medicine without a license or something like that. So as far as I see it, there are at least three. So just to be super clarify on the nature of the way at least I arrived at this is I'm not actually anti-regulation. I see regulation as a spectrum of no regulation whatsoever, all the way to the maximum amount of regulation possible. And I'm just, and I think, Nick, you are too, just trying to find where on that spectrum is the best idea to make the best possible outcomes, both short and long term, for the only folks that matter in this, which are the consumers of personal training. Fundamentally, the regulation is to help them. So we're trying to do the best by people who buy personal training services. And some amount of regulation is going to be optimal. That you and I have to come to the conclusion that the very, very small amount of regulation, and probably none of it coming from government, or very limited amount, is probably the best. And how did we arrive at this? It was not just looking at the downsides of regulation. That's easy to do. We'll get to that in just a bit. The regulation has serious upsides that have to be contended with, and if we're not admitting the upsides, we're not really being rational at all. So the first, the benefit I can see of regulation, potentially, hypothetically, and many of these really do happen in practice, is it raises the standard of practice. Like in the United States, you can't be a doctor if you're just not intelligent or knowledgeable enough to pass the MCAT and so on and so forth and pass your boards. So we can guarantee you that if you're a practicing doctor in the United States, you're very, very intelligent, you know a lot of stuff, which is really good. So every doctor, oh, there's your cat. Every doctor in the United States that practices is at least a very good doctor by standards of the world, right? So if you went to another country, possibly one in a very developing nation, and someone said, I'm a doctor, you could think all sorts of things of how much that person really know. American doctors are really amazing, and so are the doctors in much of the developed world, because there's a filtering system where you just can't call yourself a doctor unless you really, really, really know your stuff, right?
Sure.
Number two is the practice of regulation basically almost completely eliminates sort of highly substandard practices from legal operation. And there's a very big caveat, because people will still do things under the table, right? That black markets in personal training would absolutely result if you imposed nationwide regulation. The degree of those markets is, depending on the regulation and the enforcement and so on and so forth. But on average, legal operations would just have very few substandard practices, or fewer, because the raising the standard of practice means that everyone who's left over is not going to suck. So the number one is, on average, the average personal trainer you ever see will be at least this good and better. And also, the really bad ones are probably just not legally training people. It's a very different thing to say that they don't exist, but at least they legally don't exist. And another sort of side benefit, sort of final point number three on the real upsides of regulation, is that you can set an objective standard of competency for future folks that want to be personal trainers, to know that they have to. So for example, right now, people are like, I want to be a personal trainer. What do I need to learn? And there's a lot of answers to that. There's a lot of private courses. You can learn on YouTube. You can learn just experimenting on clients, sort of, who knows? But if you want to be a physical therapist, for example, in the United States, and there's national licensure for that, you know exactly what you need to do. You need to take XYZ college course, pass XYZ exam, do XYZ internship, and then you're in, right? So it makes it relatively straightforward, not to say it's easy, for future personal trainers. And sort of related to that on the customer side is, when a customer finds a personal trainer, finally in this regulated system, they can be reasonably certain that they're getting a pretty good trainer, which is a really, really good thing. And that is, I think, I'm sure there are other benefits of regulation that I haven't covered, but those to me are the ones that really stand out as really good ones.
I like it. Yeah, I've got the whole animals here. I got my cat over here. I got my dog by my legs, who's scratching out my leg for attention. So
Excellent.
I all great points. I will add just a very subtle, just piggyback off of what you said, is I think some sort of regulation where you had to pay a little more money, maybe had to pass some sort of board exam, would eliminate that the people who are not very serious. And what I mean by that is, oh, I'm an accountant and I just lost my job. I'm going to be a trainer because I like to go to the gym, right? And it was just like, and they get into the field, just like, well, I like to lift weights. I got good arms, right? It would kind of make them jump through a few more hoops and invest and say, well, if I'm really going to do this, I need to put a little bit more time into this. So obviously more serious on the front end, which means a little bit more serious on the back end. Totally agree with that. And I think all your points are very valid there. One thing that I want to talk about in regards to a test is one kind of consensus that I seem to get from trainers is they seem to say, like, and it's normally folks who have more of a solid academic background knowledge, but because everybody kind of agrees on the fundamental principles of physiology and biomechanics, right? They say, well, we at least like to see trainers have some standards, knowledge on basic fundamentals of physiology and biomechanics. Now, the question is, well, I'm not against that, of course. I'm not coming from an academic background, but I say, well, why is that? And normally the idea is that connecting that knowledge with making the client's experience safer, making that trainer less of a liability, essentially, less likely to hurt the client. However, I did another post about this. We don't need to speculate in regards to what reasons clients commonly get hurt under the tutelage of trainers. All we have to do is look at two things. A, look at lawsuits in regards to where the trainer was found liable. They're easy to find online. And two, which is also easy to find online, I've written some articles about this, look at emergency room statistics. These are kept, at least in the US, that came from exercise. And these are kept, they're very easy to find every year. And see what the most common injuries come from in the gym. And you see that neither one of those two issues come from a lack of the trainer knowing, how to explain the physiology of the mitochondria, or, to regurgitate the different energy systems or anything like that. Normally it's lack of common sense, right? It's jumping on boxes that are too high. The boxes they're wobbly and they shouldn't have been jumping on in the first place. Things like that, keeping the treadmills running fast and have people jumping on and off the treadmills while sprinting, things that when you look back at it, you went, yeah, that was pretty obvious that was going to happen, right? The other thing is, many of these things that we see in colleges that happen are with strength coaches who have very advanced degrees. And some of these trainers are getting their pantsuit off are trainers who have very advanced degrees. So that's A. Now, I'm not against having a background knowledge. However, I would say the evidence doesn't say that having such background knowledge will make you less of a liability. Now, I think it will help you in the programming process a little bit better because you'll understand what energy systems, and how to train them and things. So I don't think the making a trainer less more knowledgeable in biology, physiology, and biomechanics is making them a safer trainer is a good argument, but I think it's a good argument to say that they might be a more competent trainer from other elements. So just to clarify, a good reason and a bad reason. Now, that other being said, though, is that personally, this is anecdotal, but it's what we have to go on. I've never been able to connect great trainer with academic background, right? Because you can be a walking, talking textbook, but as soon as you get on the gym floor and you got all these things happening, especially if you're in a big box gym, it doesn't mean that you're competent actually working with people. So myself, this kind of goes into the free market thing now and the self-regulation. I can regulate as a business owner. If I still have my gyms, which I had before, I can regulate what I want to see as my baseline education. I can train you as whatever education that I want, and I can train you up on all our safety procedures and all the things that I feel like that make the trainers less safe based on these statistics. And I can work on systems that I feel are important to me. So I can raise that level to as high as I want it. The question is when somebody else comes along and says, this is what you have to do. Now, here's where we start to get into the issues of actually what does this regulation look like when it's implemented? It's interesting to me because a lot of trainers seem to think that whatever the regulation that's implemented is actually implemented, that it will agree with what they agree with. Well, what happens if the people making the rules are telling you half the things that you are doing aren't good, right? We can't even get trainers to agree on anything. Unstable surfaces, good or bad? How much barbell work should you do? We got power lifters arguing with bodybuilders. We got functional trainers arguing with corrective people. We got corrective people arguing with corrective people. We got power lifters arguing with power lifters. You can't even get trainers to agree on a dang thing except the fact that they should exercise hard and exercise regularly. So where does this board come from? Who pays for it? So this is what it comes down to. It's not what's right or wrong, it's who decides, right? So what happens now? We got to pay this money. and we are told that certain things that we do are subpar. Certain machines we can't have, things that we know work, things that we've been proven. Or let's say it's decided that you need a degree to be a trainer. Now, maybe people like me, I don't have a degree, I'm grandfathered in, right? But now it severely limits your hiring pool. But maybe you found, as a lot of businesses have found, that you hire on personality, train for skill. So some of your superstars that got the personalities, because it is personal training, that would be making you a killing that clients would buy into and love, they come in, they don't have a degree, but a lot of the people that have degrees are super nerds, and they don't know how to talk their way in or out of anything. So when we actually start implementing some of this, it's not too attractive, right? Now, you brought up some other things on the phone call. I'll get to my little big fitness thing in a second. But you brought up some other issues with if this regulation is implemented, what it actually may look like in the real world.
Yeah, particularly what sorts of unintended consequences it may have.
Bingo.
And one of these points opens up, and I'll finish with this one, and it'll open back up into your discussion of who actually is going to be in charge, because there's a lot to say there. Mm-hmm. So I can see at least 5 unintended consequences of regulation that a lot of folks don't think about, because if you think about just the good stuff, I mean, who wouldn't want a better qualified pool of trainers with the crappy trainers out of the mix? Like, that's amazing, right? Couple of downsides that come in. If you start to regulate, the average price of training goes up because the supply of trainers goes down. Okay, it's simply not the case that every trainer is going to pay to get regulated. Some trainers won't meet the muster. And hilariously, if every trainer gets paid to get regulated, you probably won't see an improvement in quality, because it's all the same stupid people that were always being awful, and now they're being awful with a stamp. So if your regulation is stringent and you say, I want training quality to be really high, then the price per trainer will be concomitantly very, very high. So when you're selling this to customers, you got to give them the truth about what they're getting. So if you're saying, look, trainers have to be regulated, and someone says, like, doesn't that mean they'll be more expensive? You have to be like, yeah, on average, absolutely. People talk about doctors. You want to pay for a personal trainer what you pay for a doctor? Everyone's going to be like, no, are you kidding me? That's insane. Be like, okay. So we're on no added money from today up to $500 an hour. Would you like to pay for a personal trainer? And the answer is, gee, I really kind of wish there was a spectrum of trainers, some of them who were really cheap, but maybe not great, and some who were super ultra elite expensive that I could choose. That's most people's answer in their private life, but sometimes when they put on their politics hat, that goes out the window. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is very related. There is going to be folks that sort of can't afford and have the wherewithal to go through with the certification and to go through with the regulation. And that means below some price per hour of personal training, you just have almost no one, right? Because it just doesn't make any sense to charge a certain small amount. For example, if we're regulating, let's say, doctors to the point where they have to go through all this crazy medical school, when a doctor finishes medical school, they're not going to render their services for $50,000 a year. It's just not, it does nonsense. And the minimum cost of medical school is insane. A lifetime spent learning. By the time they get out, look, you're talking about at least $150,000, more like $200,000 a year that they're going to be making. And what they make means they charge, and because the floor price of a doctor is here, or the floor competency is here, the lowest price you'll see a doctor charge is quite high. So to the extent that you regulate personal training, you'll see a price floor come up below which you simply won't be able to hire one. So for example, right now, if you want to hire a personal trainer that is just maybe a high school student, pretty sharp, exercises can help you to some extent more than you can help yourself. You can hire them for $5. If they train you in your basement, you can hire them for 10, below minimum wage or at least above, and then everyone wins, right? They get some really good experience training you. You get a super cheap personal trainer, or you could train better than you. If we put in the regulations and really stringently enforce them, that's gone. And the question is, who's hurt by that? Well, New York City mom that goes to Equinox and pays $120 per hour for personal training, she couldn't care less. So to her, she may say, oh, wow, yeah, regulation's a real great idea. Make sure poor people aren't getting ripped off by terrible trainers. Well, your idea of ripped off is my idea of services rendered. If I'm an individual without a ton of income, which, by the way, are the least healthy individuals in the United States on average and the most need personal training, they were going to be largely priced out if you create a certain type of regulation. Where imagine they used to be able to pay the kid, the teenager $10, paid him to, teenager down the street $10 an hour, and they put him through a barbell complex workout. It was great. It did something. Now that teen's not allowed to work as a personal trainer, and the only trainer you have is that other guy on your block who's a professional. He charges $40 an hour or more. And you and I have been around the industry, Nick. That's still cheap as hell. Like, most people charge way more than that.
Right.
So $40 an hour is not an amount of money most people in the bottom quintile or quartile of income can they're not even going to entertain that. That's an insane luxury expense. And goodbye any sort of fitness help for them that's one-on-one. And we're basically making a certain type of interaction illegal. It's almost like the analogy here is kind of stupid, but it makes sense analogically. Aliens come down and they're all trillionaires. They're super advanced. And they see you buying food at a restaurant, and they're like, wait a minute, no, you call this food? And you're like, well, yeah, it tastes good to me. The chef made it, he's good. And they're like, no, the chef's not competent. He doesn't even have a tranquilizer 5,000, which makes all of our food. And like, okay, so how do you get a stamp on the chef? Like, well, he's going to have to pay $1 trillion a year for the cert. And you're like, okay, so how much does this food have to cost for me to be able to afford it? Like, well, at least $1 billion a meal. And then you're like, but can't I just pay $20? And they're like, well, are you kidding me? You're going to get this low quality stuff. I'm doing this for you. But you're really not doing it for everyone. You're not actually helping anyone. You're just saying this category of interaction is now illegal, which is not great. And it hurts exclusively the poorest folks. That's gnarly.
For sure. And I know you have a few more points. Also, look at this. Let's say if I'm a new trainer, I'm your buddy, right? Actually, I'm not a trainer. You and I are just working out together. You're not Mike Israetel, trainer extraordinaire. I'm not Nick Tumminello. And we're working out together. I have read a few articles and I'm showing you some things and you get hurt. Now I can get hit as illegal personal training, right? Even though I'm just showing you some things and we're buddies. So now there's all this legal liability. How much advice? Although you technically gave personal training advice, Nick.
Yeah. A good lawyer could render it as a misuse of licensure. Absolutely.
See, so again, it could be nightmare upon nightmare. So anyway, finish
for sure. Very related next point. If you have a licensure which biases either towards more intelligent people with access to resources, or people that have a certain amount of minimum money in order to afford licensure and to go through, maybe if they don't have the money that, if the licensure doesn't cost a lot itself, the education to get it, so on and so forth, you're actually creating a barrier to entry to would-be trainers. Currently in the United States, and I think this is a net good thing, you can get out of jail and go work as a personal trainer in no time flat because you were training in jail. Maybe you read some books in jail about training. You got really passionate. A lot of people change their lives after they get out and become awesome, super productive, peaceful members of society by helping other folks get in shape. Because when they were, in the can, that's all they could do to pass the time, and they really invest themselves. Those folks might have a real hard time coming up with the money or the intellect or the time and so on and so forth to actually be able to pass the regulatory certification. And then all of a sudden, you're essentially pushing them out of a job, right? And who does this affect? It affects the less educated folks the most. Imagine this. Somebody never graduated high school. They want to be a personal trainer. It's totally. Right now, it's completely legal to do that in almost every area of the United States. Let's say that you say, okay, in order to be a personal trainer in the United States with this new cert, minimum high school diploma, which, Nick, between you and I, most people think that's funny because they'd be like, well, at least an undergrad degree, and I'm sorry to use the term, it's politically loaded, but that's a privileged ass place to come from. And there's nothing wrong with privilege. You just admit it, just put it on the table. That's privilege. But that privilege is earned. You pay a lot of money and a lot of time. And somebody who doesn't have a high school diploma, doesn't have an undergrad, and maybe has done some jail time, maybe all three, maybe none of those three, but they're now in a position where they may just, a very, very difficult time qualifying for that career, which means two things. One, they don't get to help people. And two, they don't get to help themselves. So, it's like aliens coming down and be like, who's your best doctor? And they're like, well, this is this guy. They're like, okay, do the surgery. He does it. They're like, this is garbage. Our machine does this way better. You're not good enough to qualify as a doctor. You can't work as a doctor anymore. And you're like, well, that's crazy. That's an arbitrary standard. Any standard you impose on a market is arbitrary to some extent. You could say, okay, at least a high school diploma. That cuts out tons of people. At least an undergrad. Oh my God. And can you imagine if guys like me had regulatory power? I'd say at least a PhD. I don't want competitors. So how many PhDs are left over? Training is going to be an exotic service. It costs $800 an hour. So So that it really hurts a lot of the folks that probably shouldn't be hurt, like the poorest, out of shape people and folks that are less educated and have maybe been through some hard stuff in life and can't muster up the capacity to pass a regulation or to go through with it. Point number 4, and I'll get to 5 in just a second, open up to you. Point number 4 is anytime you have a regulatory body, the wheels turn slow. And they turn slower the more intense the regulation is. Any kind of approval of new practices is going to be delayed. Right now, if you're a personal trainer and you've read about BFR training, like, right, Katsu training with occlusion, you can read about it in a couple journals, read a systematic review, try it on yourself, and then tomorrow you're trying it with clients. Amazing. Straight delivery of the highest quality science right away. If we had a governing body, gee whiz, it could take them 5 years to review the lit. It could take them 10. Look at the FDA. There's drugs that are really awesome at stuff, and it's to their regulatory advantage for PR to just make sure everything's ultra safe at the expense of people currently dying in hospitals from stuff that they have drugs for, which won't let them use. So extreme example, I know, but it will just make the whole profession slower. It reduces innovation, and it at least reduces the pace of innovation. And lastly, for these downsides of regulation, and this is a huge one that you're going to take after I get done just basically outlining it. Folks, when they think regulation, they think for sure objectivity, right? And since a lot of personal trainers will probably hear this talk, I'll tell you guys this. What do you guys think about how doctors prescribe nutrition plans? And many of you may think like, it's terrible. Okay, but doctors are real smart, right? And that's part of their job is to tell folks to eat better and lose weight, but they mess it up in a bunch of ways. They're really good at it in some ways, and sometimes they're really bad at it. Because that's the nature of the regulatory body, it's just not paying attention to those things. Now, there's also in regulatory bodies a really common effect called, in some cases, regulatory capture. It's when very, very interested folks that are being regulated, it's in their interest to make sure that they pack the committees as much as possible with their people so that they come out on top. People think that regulation is going to make this super objective science-based test every year. It's going to be updated. Brad Schoenfeld will be in charge, and then everything will just be up and up. I'm going to say this as gently as I can. I have a ton of respect for like fitness sport, CrossFit, stuff like that. But, you know, do you want CrossFit in charge of your regulatory committee? They have more money than you. They have more influence than you. They're better than you at a lot of stuff. And they have such a huge profit and loss effect in the fitness space that if imagine they say, okay, regulation, CrossFit gym owners and their trainers are no longer valid. You got to pass our stuff. Don't you think that CrossFit Corporation might be like, we don't want to get literally regulated out of business. Maybe if we get involved with this regulatory committee, we can pass some of our own stuff. Now, that's not blaming CrossFit. Any giant business body would do the same thing. It's self-interested behavior. Hey, listen, CrossFit might make better trainers, and in many ways does, than stupid science-based stuff. CrossFit's doing a lot right. But do you want one monolithic entity to essentially take over? Because careful how you answer this in your head. If you say, well, that'll never happen, do you believe that lobbying biases organizations to do things in certain ways? If you don't think there's a problem with lobbying in the United States, there's a problem with corporate influence, there's a problem with banks, for example, self-regulating, quote unquote, writing their own regulations, then cool. Like, I actually respect your position somewhat. Maybe it's not as bad as people say. But if you think that's pretty bad, whatever in your brain is keeping you from concluding that maybe if we let personal training become mandatory government regulation, that the very folks you're not really in agreement with might rise to the top of those organizations, and then you're going to have to do what they say. You're going to be teaching weird Bosu-ball stuff and answering Bosu-ball questions on your tests. You're like, I can't believe this is true. Why can't I just do what science says? Well, guess what? Regulation and what science says might only parse to some extent and not completely, and you're going to be in a bad deal with all of the incentives in the world set up for those folks, the people who make the most money in fitness, to have as much of a say as possible. And money wins a lot. So it's nothing I'm super comfortable giving a ton of power to people to essentially tell all the personal trainers not how to do their jobs. That's not what regulation is for. How to not do their jobs. That's a tough case. What do you think?
And also making you pay for a lot of things that you don't agree with, right?
Of course, it makes it more money.
Any system that works is based on human motivations and incentives. Well, what you just said is what happens when people get power. They have their own motivations and their own incentives that they're going to stick with, and they're going to bring their friends in. It's just like everything that we hear about. Now, circling everything you said there, What you're also going to get, we've all heard big pharma, right? We hear big tech. You're going to get big fitness. Big fitness is, oh, you're one of those trainers. You're under the thumb of big fitness. You only listen. You're a sheep. They tell you what they want to tell you. We outside of here, we're free birds, right? We think for ourselves. We don't buy into that stuff. All it will do is enhance the non official stamped trainers and create not even an underground. They'll actually proudly say it. You're just part of big pharma and you just listen to them. We can do all these treatments. And like you said, whatever is new and whatever is maybe not new or just sexy, we can do that here. And athletes are going to run to it because they're looking for every edge that they possibly can. So people are going to think that you are just brainwashed by other people that they don't trust. And it's going to create another market that will expand, that people will go to and like, oh, I went to big fitness trainers and they didn't help me, but I went to so-and-so, so-and-so guru and I lost 10 pounds in 10 days with the so-and-so methodology, that's too hot for TV kind of deal, right? We see this all the time. We see this in everything. It drives, when you try to regulate something, it drives people towards the thing you're trying to get people away from, because people just go, screw you, don't tell me.
Why is it forbidden?
Yeah,
why are you not letting me use it? Maybe
Correct.
you have something to gain.
Normally that's what they think. Normally they think it's because you're afraid of it. And also, number two, as an adult, people who are also doctors and lawyers are like, look, don't tell me what to do. I can make decisions for myself, right? Again, human motivations, it actually makes it more intriguing. So it'll just open up a whole new realm of people that just go, we're over here, screw you and your big fitness type of thing.
Sure, for sure. And it no longer seems like it's on even footing, because the people who have the regulatory situation captured, they can always be accused of just muscling their way in and not really debating on terms or on results. Like, if you have to have a law to protect yourself, what is it that needs protecting? Doesn't your thing stand up on its own merits? There's no regulation for how a burger has to taste or how it's made. If there was, you'd be like, why wouldn't they let the burgers be made the other way? Are we missing out on something?
Right.
So on and so forth. Now, I think at this point, a lot of folks think that, okay, it should be Wild West freewheeling and everyone out for themselves. But believe it or not, we actually have some constructive remarks about the beneficial kinds of regulation that can occur. Nick, do you want me to start off my couple points on this?
Yeah, because I'm actually not really sure what you're going to get at on this one. So yeah, hit it.
Sweet, there we go. So for the current conditions, what are some good alternatives aside from a huge governing regulatory body? One, and a lot of this is already happening, and I would like more of this to happen. One is we want to have multiple private certification bodies, governing bodies that grant certification. One of the benefits of this is it creates competition. You want, as a governing body, to be seen as objective, to be seen as protective of the consumer, and to be guaranteeing high quality trainers. You don't want someone who, let's say you have Nick Tumminello Training Inc. governing body, and there's a video of your trainer getting someone hurt on the internet. Oh my God, that's terrible PR for you. You have every reason to make your certification pretty legit so that people, when they have it, it's like, oh wow, like that's a sign of quality, right? But one of the companies in our space, Precision Nutrition, has the Precision Nutrition certification. It's a serious certification, and it means like when I see someone who's Precision Nutrition certified, I know they know their nutrition. Like, they just do. Now that doesn't make them, PhD candidates, but gee, if someone's like, hey, my Precision Nutrition coach said, I'm automatically like, oh, I'm really curious what they had to say. I'm not like, oh, who the hell is that person anyway, right? So if you have a lot of governing bodies, it is not mandatory, but a lot of trainers go out and seek out these certifications because it impresses the customer. And that is, a really, really big part of how regulation works. Now, because you have this giant sort of pool of certifications, there's going to be a natural gradation from basic certifications all the way to intermediate ones, all the way to super ultra serious ones that you have to sink a ton of money, a ton of time, tons of prerequisites for, and only then do you get it. Like master trainer type of situation, right? And this is great because not only does it allow the people in the industry, the personal trainers themselves, to sort of assert themselves wherever they feel like they're qualified for and what they can afford, basic cert for everyone, and then maybe you grade up to an intermediate cert eventually, and then eventually an advanced cert if that's in your wheelhouse. Not only does it do that, it's an awesome signal to the consumer. So a consumer goes and it says, I want to buy personal training, right? Now, like when I don't know anything about cars or mechanics, but when I go to a mechanic, I don't go to a random mechanic down the street. I just don't. I go to a reputable place that I know advertises locally or nationally, that I know the two things will happen. One, they're a good target for lawsuits if they screw me up because they know they have money and they have a legal team. And two, I know that they know this, and thus they have a minimum standard of who the hell they employ, and they make sure he does a good job. So same way, when someone goes out and gets personal training, the problem really isn't, oh my God, there's all these terrible trainers out there. There's actually just one problem. Why the hell is the customer paying these people? If I'm going to get personal training, I don't know anything about training, first thing I'll ask is, are you certified in some capacity? If the person's like, well, no, I'm going to be like, next, right? And then if the person's like, well, I have a master's degree in exercise physiology, I'm certified by these 3 governing bodies. Look, folks, it's the age of the internet. Regulation was largely, licensure was largely designed for when information costs were incredibly high and a government stamp told you all the information you need to know. Information's almost free now. So if someone says, I'm licensed by the ACYUS Institute, all I do is I go on my phone, I Google it, and I just go to the Wikipedia page, and it's like a very reputable institute for licensing trainers, or it's like scam, chiropractic, hack, and I'm like, okay, well, that person's stupid, and I'm not hiring them. Or if it's a good cert, I'm like, wow, this is super great. So as a customer, if I care that my trainer is certified, I can find a trainer in any one of the gradations, and that's awesome. And remember, the gradations are going to correspond to prices. Super elite trainer, $200 an hour. It's not my jam. Super beginner trainer, $15 an hour. That sounds good to me. And then I know I'm just getting a beginner trainer. So there's no illusion as to about what I'm getting. So it fits the customer super well. And look, if I go out there and I recruit a personal trainer, I don't care about his qualifications. How can I possibly be upset about the state of regulation in the industry when I just physically didn't care? It's like, if you think there should be food regulation, like extensive regulation of who can serve food, right? I can see how you're making a good point. But if you, the same person who thinks that, you stop on the side of the freeway and a guy hands you a hamburger patty off his hand and he's like $1, and you're like, oh, gee, that sounds good. And you eat it, you pay him $1. I don't think you really believe that regulation should be a thing, because you clearly can't discriminate among what is obviously good and obviously bad. You just don't care. So my last point on this is I think we should be in an environment where we as fitness professionals encourage customers, consumers in the fitness space to look for certified personal trainers that have a good degree of education and are certified by governing bodies that we respect and are science-based. There's tons of folks out there. There's like the Shredded by Science certification. There's the MACU Nutrition, Mark McDonald's course. I know some of these people personally, some I don't. But these sound like, if you look at their stuff, they're great evidence-based folks that have serious certs. And if you have one, I know you know what you're doing. So when people ask me all the time, like, hey, I need a personal trainer, what should I look for? I tell them various certifications to look for in that trainer and various red flags for the kind of stuff they say to show that they're not science-based, they don't know what they're doing. Because an educated is, if the consumers just know the couple basic things to look for, it's the same as licensure, because they'll never work with anyone who's not certified, but it's a much more open spectrum and they can choose what they need and everyone is accommodated. So it's more like it's less like you can't do this, but you must do that. It's much more like, here's the situation, act intelligently. And it's not that complicated.
That's right. You can't regulate, and that's basically trying to say you shut your brain off, we'll tell you what to do. And people do not like to be bossed around, right? Some people are going to make mistakes, some people are going to lose out short, but that's human behavior, is like, hey, don't tell me. And why are you afraid of this? Why are you trying to tell me what to do? What you're saying is, let me decide for myself and let me learn for myself. Sometimes you will make mistakes along the way. So you talked about it from a consumer education perspective, which turns into consumer protection. I'll cover from elevating the field perspective, because a lot of trainers will say, well, we want to elevate the field. I'll tell you how to elevate the field. Demonstrate the behavior that you wish to see from other trainers.
And help them achieve it by educating them.
Bingo, right? So, dress the way you want to dress. If you think we should all have a uniform and cleaner clothes and be clean shaven, do that. if you think the best systems are certain types of training procedures and holding trainers to a very high standard before you hire them or before they work with you, do that. If you have a certain system that you feel works, train all your trainers up to reach your own standard. And if it works, if all your clients are happy and you're kicking ass and you're rolling in the bucks, talent finds attention. The rest of us will watch very closely and we will pay you to teach us. And lo and behold, the industry will elevate to the level that you're at. My concern, however, is most of the time I see trainers, many of them, they tend to look at themselves and whatever they are good at, they tend to think that that's how the industry should be regulated too,
Sure.
which means there's a little bit of that dictator kind of thing, which means that everybody else in the field just needs to be a little more like me. You got to talk like me, you got to think like me. Okay, the problem is if I take 5 of you together, there's going to be 5 of you me's and how it should be done, and you all are the ones arguing on social media, and you think the other one's an idiot and a hack and a guru and all these other things that we see all the time. So let the rest of us decide that. Don't try to dictate it. Don't try to dictate how I train, right? And I will
Try to convince me.
how you train. Is exactly right. Show me. Do a great job. Let your talent find attention. And if I want you to be my lighthouse, I will come and say, here's my money, be my lighthouse.
On merit.
That's how you elevate the field. We all have every incentive to not hurt people. We can get sued and end up living in our friggin' parents' basement for the rest of our life and lose everything. So we have regulation. We have regulation to keep our gyms clean if you own a facility. There is a lot of things in place, and also from the free market, but also from government standards. What we're saying is that is enough. The rest of the things that we're trying to see with trainers, elevating the field, consumer protection, those things can be taken care of by ourselves. Educate the consumer, educate other trainers. So we'll close it on the best regulation is self-regulation.
Yeah, absolutely. And just my sort of parting thoughts, it's not an ideological, on my end at least, and I'm sure on yours, Nick, it's not an ideological hatred of regulations that brings us to the conclusion that minimum is best here. I, for example, consider myself an environmentalist. I think environmental regulations where the incentives align poorly for businesses to have no cost to pollution, I think they're incredibly important. And I like environmental regulations, but it's the same judgment. It's maximum environmental regulation, no environmental regulation, through costs and benefits, a net balance of what's best for society. Where is that drawn? Is it just a few basic regulations? Is it very extensive regulation? I'm not sure. It's specific to the industry, specific to the field. With personal, with medical regulation, I could be convinced that it's like over here, right? But with personal training regulation, I'm convinced it's probably somewhere over here. And we're always open to ideas. If you disagree with us after seeing this, absolutely let us know. Maybe have a good point. Maybe you'll bring yourself to our side. If the last joke is, if we were regulators, we wouldn't let you tell us what to say, and we would just say do this or shut up.
There you go. Good point. And it goes back to the old Thomas Sowell. Anytime you bring up a policy, the question is at what cost and as opposed to what.
Yep.
So what we're saying is that sure, regulation will do these things good, but there's going to be a ton of unintended consequences, and the cure for what you're trying to cure or the problem that it creates may be worse. So it's going to create a lot of other problems, and it would make it worse, guarantee it'd be worse for a lot of other people like you and I who are doing a good job trying to elevate the field.
Yep. And
right?
If you want to improve the field. Don't just make being shitty illegal.
Very, very, very well said. And I'll close with this. It's interesting. When I first got into writing and I saw other trainers that were writing, and I still see this, a lot of other trainers, the same ones that bitch about the field being low standard and all these things that they hate about the field, then they bitch about trainers writing. Oh, you think you're hot stuff by, writing, and you think you're an expert. Well, it's like, if you want to see the field elevated, then you have to take time to share what you're doing to the rest of us. How else are you going to see problems?
That's how people learn. I learned a ton reading your articles, and what if you didn't write? That would be insane. Who says things like that?
Yes. So, put yourself out there, share it, and let the free market of ideas sort it out. And, rising tide raises all ships, man. I appreciate you doing this, Mike. It was awesome. And
Thank you so much.
looking forward to seeing the feedback when we get this posted. See you, brother.
Oh, are you done recording yet? Or you are done now? No, you're still recording.
Hang on.